Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Strangelove is not just a movie. Please welcome researcher and lecturer Michael Anton and former Deputy National Security Advisor and CPAC board member K.T. McFarland.
I have a quick question. Does anybody remember the movie Dr. Strangelove? Yes. Oh, okay. Well, I saw it when it first came out. And for those of you who are far too young to have your parents or your grandparents tell you about it, Dr. Strangelove was a movie, it was a spoof, but it was a movie about nuclear war. And it was, the theme of it was, hey, wait, nuclear war is going to happen, so you might as well just lean back and enjoy it. Well, that was in the 1960s. Nuclear war didn't happen. And in fact, we won the Cold War in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And for the lifetimes of most under 40-year-olds or under 30-year-olds, they don't even know kind of what nuclear weapons are. Or they certainly don't have any idea about a nuclear war. However, in the last year, we've started talking about nuclear war again. So, Dr. Anton, who was with me in the Trump administration and the National Security Council, one of the really bright, brilliant thinkers about conservative causes and foreign policy and national security. He is with me today, and we are going to reprise the act that we did for President Trump when we were not worried about nuclear war in Europe. So we want to talk about Russia, Ukraine, the United States, NATO, the whole range of issues. I want to start out by saying, well, a year ago at CPAC, Michael, I don't know if you were here, but a year ago at CPAC, we were all happily having our meetings, and then all of a sudden, Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine. So we're all here, we all go to the cameras, we all talk about it, and it was pretty clear Vladimir Putin thought, easy peasy, I'll be in and out in 3 days, the government of Ukraine will fall, I'll have a puppet government in Ukraine, and then I'll have Greater Russia restored. So I want to ask Michael Anton, why did Putin think he could get away with it? What thinking led him to that?
Well, why he thought he could get away with it is because his country is so much larger, his military is so much larger. He thought that Ukraine was weak, that Ukraine would be a pushover, and that he thought, I think that that eastern third of Ukraine is so pro-Russia, they would have essentially welcomed him with open arms and he could get it done very, very quickly. Obviously, it's a year later, and that hasn't happened, and yet the war grinds on.
The war does grind on. So from the perspective of where we are now, so here we are a year into it. It turns out the Ukrainian military did fight. The Ukrainian president did not get on a plane as the Biden administration offered to kind of get him out, sneak him out in the dead of night from Ukraine. The Ukrainians have fought, NATO has come together, the United States at an enormous expense has been supporting the Ukrainian effort, and yet the war grinds on. So, Michael, if I have to ask you, how does this war, is this war going to just keep grinding on? Can the Russians fight forever?
I don't know if they can fight forever, but it does seem to be indefinite. I mean, it's a country that's GDP is larger, population base is larger, its military base is larger. The amount of material it can throw at it. Ukraine is only in the fight because of Western aid. Right. So it's conceivable that as long as the Western aid keeps flowing, neither side really gains the upper hand. It could go on a lot longer. Nothing is indefinite, but you could imagine it going on for another year easily without any clear resolution and without either side really even gaining the upper hand.
Now, I want to backtrack a little bit and say at the beginning of the Trump administration, we understood the enormous advantage that American energy gave us, not only for the American economy of being energy independent, but it gave us the ability to become energy dominant in the world. In other words, we could, because of American energy, yay America, and American engineers and geologists and frackers, they understood that we could get energy by digging down into rocks and taking oil and natural gas out of rocks. It's about 10 years ago they figured out how to do it. And then they figured out we had the best rocks of anybody in the world. So as a result, we could produce oil and natural gas at far more competitive prices than any other country could in the world. That became energy independence, and that's what we set out to do in the Trump administration. But then we realized we could become energy dominant. In other words, America had enough energy, especially natural gas, to power the whole world. Forget the Middle East, forget Russia, forget everybody. Power the whole world for a century or two. And we also realized that our companies could make a profit if oil was at, say, $50 a barrel. Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, other countries, they needed oil at about $80, $90 a barrel because the government owned all of the energy companies, and the government used those profits to fund the rest of government. So in the Trump administration, we set out, we're going to be energy dominant. What happened to the price of energy? It plummeted. What happened to American energy companies? Terrific, they were making money. What happened to Russia? Broke. And if you look at the history of Russia, before that the Soviet Union, when energy prices were high throughout the last 50 years, Russia has rebuilt its military, invaded its neighbors, and fought proxy wars around the world. So when President Biden comes in and his first act is to cancel and go to war against American energy independence, the American energy industry, predictably what happened? We stopped producing oil and natural gas. It's simple supply demand that I guess they don't understand in the West Wing. But simple supply and demand meant that prices went up. Vladimir Putin got rich. Yippee, I'm going to go do what I wanted to do before, which is to go in and to invade Ukraine and take part of Ukraine. So, Michael, if I'm looking at Russia right now and I'm saying, gee, the price of energy is going to remain high, right, because the American war on fossil fuels, thanks to President Biden, does that mean Vladimir Putin can just fight forever? He's got a lot of money.
Well, as you know, nothing is forever. You'll remember well, and maybe some of the audience will, how one reason, there are many reasons why the Cold War was won, but one important reason was dramatic American, and then we convinced allies to really ramp up production in the mid to the late 1980s. Price of energy cratered, and 5 years later, the Soviet Union fell, and that was a huge contributing factor. I think the other thing with regard to energy is that Putin knows that the European economy, in particular Germany, the European industrial economy, is completely dependent on Russian oil and gas. And I think part of his miscalculation is he thought that they would quickly be brought to heel out of fear, and they haven't yet been. There's a game of chicken going on between, how long can he threaten the German industrial economy before the Germans say it's time to bring an end to this or start with peace talks. So far, neither side has backed off. He hasn't backed off, but I think to his surprise, the Germans haven't said, even quietly, we probably need to start talking about a deal because our industrial economy is being hurt. And that's one of those other dynamics that the longer it plays out, the more just everybody gets hurt. And to me, this is a war, well, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but without yet a clear winner. And I don't just mean in terms of a resolution. I can't even tell you right now, who's winning, who's gaining, except for one, but I'll leave that for a moment.
Okay, so we're in a situation now, it's gone on for a year. It's likely to go on, as even the president has talked about, going on for more years. The Russians, even if they've run out of weapons, they're buying weapons from China, from Iran, elsewhere. Oil prices continue to stay high. Russia continues to have the wherewithal and the money to keep fighting. We, on the other hand, so talk to me about what you think's happening with NATO, with the United States. Do we keep spending $100 billion a year for the Ukrainians to fight the war?
I sure hope not. I think it's a terrible deal for the American taxpayer. And let's not forget, too, it's not simply a matter of going to the store and buying new weapons. These things take a long time to procure and develop. We've vastly, this is an underreported story, the U.S. military has vastly depleted its own stocks, sending these things over there, that you can't just go and pick up new ones on the, in a week or a month. It's going to take years to get back to where we were in terms of our own procurement and our own readiness, where we were in February of last year. And I'm waiting, hoping, fingers crossed, to see cool heads in the national security establishment prevail and say, all right, we have to stop this or dramatically slow it down, because whatever we may or may not be accomplishing in Ukraine, we're hurting our own readiness, and we've got other fish to fry and other adversaries to face, and that's not a smart position for us to be in.
Okay, so when Michael and I, the first week we were in the White House, the first couple of days, I'm in the Oval Office with President Trump, And normally a new president gets calls, from foreign leaders saying, congratulations, great job, looking forward to working with you. So the German chancellor, Angela Merkel, gets on the phone and she's this, hello, congratulations. And I'm sitting there, I'd done all the, prepared all the talking points I wanted President Trump to say. So she says, what are you going to do about Ukraine? He flings the papers off the front of the table. And he said, what are you going to do about Ukraine? It's your neighborhood. It's your neighbor. Why are you not stepping up to do something about Ukraine? So even though Michael has rightly said the Germans and others have helped, when you add all the contributions of all the European countries together, they're still not what the United States is doing. So if we're looking forward to how does this war end, I'm looking at it and saying, all right, here's a couple of dynamics that we have at play. We have a Ukrainian president, and rightfully so. He's saying, I want Russia out. I want unconditional surrender on the part of the Russians. We have a White House that's saying, basically, we really want Putin out, and we want the Soviet Union to collapse. On the other hand, we have the Russians and Putin personally saying, I'm not going to lose this war. I know that if I lose this war, I lose my life. Putin understands he cannot afford to lose. So as Michael said, we're in kind of a trench warfare, World War I situation where everybody gets a little, gives a little, but nobody really advances. We have a war that could go on for a long time. And I'm looking at that and saying, okay, so I think that we're looking at two completely horrible options. On one hand, Russia says, I'm going to fight forever. I have the money to do it, and I'm just going to destroy Ukraine. I'm going to bomb it to smithereens. I'm going to do to Russia, to Ukraine, what I did to Chechnya in 2000. I'm just going to kill every man, woman, and child in Ukraine and bomb every building. On the other hand, there's, well, maybe we escalate. Do we involve NATO? So Michael, talk me through these two horrible options.
Well, when either side, and as you're right to say, both sides are talking about essentially unconditional surrender, we should all hope and pray that those are just public negotiating positions to sound tough and to get as much as you can, but that neither side is serious about it. Because if you are serious about it, what you've done is you've said to your adversary, you really have no choice but to fight to the death. I've pushed you in a corner, and the only way out is to throw everything you have at me. And that's how you get a much wider war with much greater destruction, loss of life, and all kinds of potential calamities. I would like to see some of that rhetoric get dialed down, since I have no control, obviously, over what Moscow says, no control over what Washington says either, but to the extent that we have any influence, we all ought to be encouraging the people in Washington to at least signal the possibility of some kind of negotiated solution, because widening the war, ramping it up, making it clear to Putin that it is literally, his death and the death of his regime is the only real way, or total victory on his part, you're essentially egging him on to do things that you don't want to do and that could blow back very badly on us. And that's what I'm most concerned about and would like to see avoided.
Yeah, and I think that, and you and I have talked privately, I know a number of other people in the national security world are talking, we should stop calling each other names. That if you're looking for some kind of a negotiated solution or less than total victory on the part of either side, you're not a pro-commie, you're not an anti-commie. You're just trying to find a way that avoids these two alternatives of complete destruction of a society and an escalation to World War III. I'm a Cold Warrior. I go back to the Reagan administration, and I watched and was, a foot soldier in the Reagan Revolution, and the way we won the Cold War the first time around was through economic means. We used a superior American economy. Michael talked earlier about saying how we convinced the Arab oil-producing countries to pump more oil. Remember, supply, demand. So the price of oil in the late 1980s went from $40 a barrel to $18 a barrel in 9 months. What that meant was Russia's income was cut in half. That, plus a whole lot of other things, meant that the Russians, the Soviet Union, it was inevitable. They were going to lose the Cold War. It was only a matter of time and how we let them down. I think that there's another alternative between total capitulation and World War III. Michael's talked about a negotiated solution, but how do you get two sides which have no interest in negotiating to the negotiating table? I think the first thing that any next president should do is to say, that Biden war on fossil fuels, I'm canceling that.
Yeah.
Not only are we going to let American energy producers do what they do best, which is give the world cheap, abundant, safe, secure natural gas and energy. But we are once again going to be energy dominant. We're going to shove the price of oil down. What does that do to the Russians? They have no choice. They may want to pursue this war till the end of time, but without the resources to pursue this war till the end of time, they're put into a position where they really have to negotiate. You know, a negotiation is so much more effective when you've got your arms around the guy's neck. And that's the way we could negotiate with Russia. So let's talk through what this new world is going to look like if we have a negotiated solution with Russia.
Well, just getting back to Reagan very briefly, everybody remembers the tough Reagan first term, evil empire speech and so on. When the Soviets were strong and riding high, Reagan was tough. But when his policies started to put them on the back heel, he became more conciliatory and wanted to talk to them, right? So if toughness is a prelude to negotiation, to me, that's the right way to use toughness, not toughness so that your adversary gets so scared he lashes out and does anything. Yeah, by all means, let's cut Russian income so that they can spend less on the military. But if there's any indication that the Russians are willing to talk and negotiate a settlement, I think the United States should be front and center, if they'll trust us to be front and center on that, if for no other reason than to just stop the bleeding and the destruction in Ukraine, which is serving no one. And I think it's also in our strategic interest not to have the worst possible relationship with Russia that we seem to have now. We're never going to be best of friends, but we don't have to be, this level of enemies. And the geostrategic picture for our own interests would greatly improve. And just in terms of energy, KT's completely right. But we should be doing that energy, just for domestic reasons, we ought to unleash energy production, just for what it does for our own economy, for what it does for our own jobs, what it does for all of our industries that use energy. And then the other benefit is what it does for us internationally. It's a policy that's so obviously good for us on every level. You wonder why it isn't being done. I mean, I know why, but it's still, you wonder why it isn't being done. And pray to God the next administration will, that's not a Democratic administration, will do that.
And then, absolutely. I mean, I think that all the presidential candidates, you're going to hear from a lot of people in the next couple of days who are running and have announced they're running for president, who will run for president, who are thinking about running for president. Yeah. By the way, that does not include you, and that doesn't include me.
No,
okay, we're out.
My exploratory committee came back and said, don't do it.
No, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. But every one of them is talking about restarting the American energy industry. It's the low-hanging fruit. It will immediately change the American economy and inflation, and it will, the day after that, change the world environment. Let me talk, I want to take things a step further. So let's say a new American president, energy independence, Russia, hands around their neck, they have to negotiate a solution, everybody gets a little bit of what they want, nobody gets everything of what they want, but we have a ceasefire. So let's talk about winning the peace. Even if you can't have unconditional surrender, complete victory on either side, what does peace look like 5 years after the fighting stops?
Well, look, peace will look like concessions from both sides. And that's a hard thing to talk about right now, in part because the Biden administration has made this such a kind of a moralistic crusade. Once you make something a moralistic crusade, and then it's hard for you to say, well, actually Russia does have some legitimate interests, even if you don't think they're legitimate, but to get a deal, you're going to have to make concessions. And in making concessions, when you've ginned up your own side to say that everything Russian is just pure evil, your own side doesn't want to make any concessions and will call you a traitor and so on, which is, if I'm a little pessimistic, I'd almost say it may require a new president to get a deal just because this administration isn't inclined to talk, and probably nobody in Moscow is inclined to listen to them anyway. But a deal would look like both sides are going to give a little, and each side is going to get a little. We're not going back to the pre-2014 borders, probably. And certain aspects, I don't want to get too wonky here, of the Minsk agreements that we're supposed to settle that will have to be implemented, and it's not going to look like the maximalist position that the Biden administration has staked out, and the sooner we all realize that, the better. KT and I were talking just briefly backstage, and we said, we agreed, look, International relations, you have to be kind of hard-headed. It's not to say there are moral considerations never apply. Of course they do. But if you make it only about moral considerations, you end up forgetting interests. You end up being inflexible. You don't see the other side's point of view, and you push things toward conflict that ultimately is against your interests and ultimately has immoral outcomes. So in being too moralistic, you can actually do things that are detrimental to what you're actually trying to seek.
Let's talk about 5 years after the fighting stops in Europe. I don't think Ukraine can win the war. I don't think Russia can win the war. But I think Ukraine can win the peace. And I think Russia loses the peace. Once the fighting stops, the West is going to rush into Ukraine. They're agriculturally rich. They have a lot of natural resources. Within 5 years, Ukraine is fully integrated into the Western economy, probably a member of NATO. They'll be strong. They'll be powerful. They'll be like a mini Germany or a Poland. 5 years after the fighting stops, where's Russia? Pariah state, thanks to the new American president who will have energy independence and energy dominance. Russia will be broke. It will have no friends anywhere. And so at the end of the day, we could win this current Cold War the same way we won the first one, without firing a shot. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a terrific time at CPAC. Thank you. Thank you.